Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping into a really fascinating slice of American history, 1992 right through to 2000.
Yeah, this is that immediate post-Cold War moment.
Huh.
The Soviet Union has collapsed, and suddenly the U.S. is, well, the world's only superpower.
Right, but it wasn't that simple, was it? There was this massive power, but a lot of uncertainty at home about how, or even if, the U.S. should wield it globally.
Exactly, that's the key tension. And domestically. Deep, deep partisan divides, the culture wars heating up. It was intense.
And this is the big contradiction, all this political fighting was happening while the economy was just roaring, one of the best expansions ever.
It really was a decade of contradictions. So today we'll unpack that. We'll look at Bill Clinton, the rise of free trade, the absolute explosion of the internet, huge shifts in integration.
And how all these threads kind of tangled together leading up to the crazy 2000 election. Okay, so let's start with 1992. The first baby boomer president takes office.
Bill Clinton.
Mhm.
And he positioned himself as a new Democrat. This was a very conscious strategy.
What did that mean, practically speaking? A new Democrat.
It meant moving the party toward the center. The Democratic Leadership Council, the DLC, was really pushing this. They wanted policies focused on economic growth, a strong defense, even being tough on crime, less of the traditional New Deal focus.
Sort of adapting to the times where market-based ideas were really dominant.
Pretty much. And the campaign focus was relentless. It's the economy, stupid. Simple, direct.
But you can't ignore H. Ross Perot in 92. He was a major factor.
Oh, absolutely. Almost 20% of the popular vote for the Texas billionaire. That's the biggest third-party result since Teddy Roosevelt back in 1912. He hammered away on the deficit.
Definitely shook things up. But Clinton wins, and then the first couple of years weren't exactly smooth, some early stumbles.
Yeah, a couple of big ones. First, he tried to end the ban on gays and lesbians serving openly in the military. That sparked a huge backlash.
And resulted in the don't ask, don't tell compromise, right?
Yeah,
Which lasted until 2010.
exactly. Then came the really high-profile fight, healthcare reform. Hillary Rodham Clinton led that charge. It was this incredibly complex, 1,300-page plan.
And it just went down in flames, a big political defeat early on.
It really was. The First Lady took a lot of heat for it, too.
Still, despite those setbacks, Clinton did notch some significant legislative wins, especially on the economic front.
That's right. The 1993 deficit reduction bill was key. It had spending cuts, but also tax increases on wealthier Americans. That, plus the booming economy, actually led to federal budget surpluses by 1998.
Which seems almost unbelievable now.
Doesn't it? And there was also the 1994 anti-crime bill funding for 100,000 police officers, a ban on certain assault weapons.
But underneath all this, there was this really strong anti-government feeling brewing in the mid-90s.
Very strong. And sometimes it had tragic outcomes. You had the Waco standoff in 93.
Which became a sort of rallying cry for some.
Exactly. And it was cited by Timothy McVeigh as a motive for the horrific Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. 168 people killed. That event really pulled back the curtain on these secretive paramilitary militia groups that were deeply suspicious of the federal government.
And that anti-government mood, that suspicion, it really fed into the political landscape, didn't it?
Yeah.
Leading to the 94 midterm.
Massively. The Republican Revolution, Newt Gingrich, the contract with America. It was a political earthquake.
Republicans took control of both the House and the Senate. First time in 40 years.
Historic. And it wasn't just about who controlled Congress. It really accelerated the sorting process, where the two parties became more ideologically pure and geographically divided. The political combat got much sharper.
One of the biggest policy wins for that new Republican majority was welfare reform in 96. That felt like a huge shift.
It was a huge shift. The Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. It put time limits on benefits, required recipients to find work, deep cuts.
Clinton signed it, which angered a lot of traditional Democrats. Was that just pure politics for re-election, or did he believe in it?
Probably a mix, but it was definitely a calculated move toward the center. It really signaled the end of an era for New Deal-style liberalism in many ways. Market thinking won out.
Around the same time, there's also push against immigration, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 96. What was happening demographically?
While you had a huge increase in immigration, especially from Latin America and Asia, migrants from Mexico were the largest group, really changing the demographics in states like California, Arizona, Texas.
The book calls it a demographic reconquista.
Yeah, it's a powerful phrase. And with these numbers came growing political organization and influence from the Latino community. Think Cesar Chavez and the UFWOC earlier, now gaining broader momentum.
But the Republicans, led by Gingrich, maybe got a bit ahead of themselves after 94,
You could definitely say that. They pushed hard for cuts to Medicare and education, which led to a major standoff with Clinton.
resulting in the government shutdowns.
Right. The federal government shut down for 27 days in total between late 95 and early 96. That didn't play well with the public. It made the Republicans look extreme and actually helped Clinton bounce back.
Which helped him win re-election pretty comfortably against Bob Dole in 96.
Yep. First Democrat reelected since FDR, though, importantly, Republicans kept control of Congress, so divided government continued.
Okay, so Clinton's second term, this is when the economy really takes center stage, right? The dot-com boom.
Absolutely. The late 90s saw the longest period of economic growth in U.S. history up to that point. Unemployment dropped to just 4%. It felt like boom times.
Fueled by low interest rates and, of course, the internet. The rise of all those dot-com companies.
And alongside that boom, there was a significant push for financial deregulation. This is really important looking back.
Or the P changes there.
Well, two stand out. They loosened the rules on complex financial products called OTC derivatives, and critically, they repealed the Glass-Steagall Act.
That was the Depression-era law, separating regular banks from investment banks.
Exactly. Repealing it allowed these huge financial supermarkets to form, merging commercial and investment banking. Lots of potential profit, but also, as we later found out, a lot of systemic risk.
So you could argue the seeds of the 2008 crisis were sown back then?
Many historians make exactly that argument, yes. And this deregulation happened alongside this fundamental shift in the economy itself, the move to the information age. Meaning the economy became less about making physical things and more about managing data, storing it, organizing it, processing it. So jobs shifted from manufacturing to service sectors.
And that meant less power for unions.
Definitely. Union membership declined, and we started seeing the outsourcing of white-collar jobs, finance, engineering, call centers moving to places like Ireland and India, where labor was cheaper.
On the global stage, Clinton was also pushing hard for free trade.
Very much so. He signed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico, in 1993. And he was a big champion of creating the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in 1994.
But not everyone was thrilled about this globalization push.
No, there was significant pushback. It really boiled over with the huge protests in Seattle in 1999 during a WTO meeting. Protesters were raising serious concerns about, the impact on workers, the environment, the downsides of unchecked global capitalism.
These big economic changes were also reshaping American society, particularly families.
Profoundly. By the 90s, women were nearly half the workforce. And importantly, most women with young children, even infants, were working outside the home.
That created a lot of debate around family values.
Huge debate. Policy tried to respond. You got the Family and Medical Leave Act, FMLA, in 93, giving job protection for taking unpaid leave for family reasons.
Unpaid leave, though. That's the key part.
Right. And it's striking the book notes that by 2016, the U.S. was the only developed nation out of 41 that didn't mandate paid parental leave. A major policy gap reflecting those debates.
And the definition of family itself was changing rapidly, too.
Yeah. The traditional nuclear family, while still an ideal for many, was becoming less statistically common. Divorce rates were high. About 1 in 2 marriages ended in divorce. But you also saw growing acceptance of different family structures. Single parents, step families, gay and lesbian parents.
Meanwhile, racial tensions remained a major issue. The LA riots in 92.
Following the acquittal of the police officers who beat Rodney King, that really exposed the deep skepticism many African Americans felt towards the justice system.
And then just a few years later in 95, the O.J. Simpson trial. That seemed to split the country right down the middle.
It really did. The televised trial, the acquittal polls showed a stark difference. Most white Americans thought he was guilty, while a majority of black Americans felt the not guilty verdict was justified, seeing it through the lens of historical injustice. The sources call it a yawning chasm in perceptions.
It's fascinating how these cultural moments reflected deeper divisions. And this connects to multiculturalism too, right?
Yes, the idea of multiculturalism, celebrating and preserving distinct ethnic and racial cultures, rather than just assimilation, gained a lot of traction in universities and intellectual circles. It led to debates about Eurocentric school curricula.
And even the census changed. In 2000, you could choose more than one race for the first time.
Right, reflecting this more complex understanding of identity.
Okay, let's pivot to foreign policy in the post-Cold War world. Clinton seemed to struggle finding a clear doctrine.
It was tough. Anti-communism had been the anchor for decades. What replaced it, it wasn't immediately clear. Early on, there was hesitation.
Like in Somalia.
Exactly. After U.S. soldiers were killed there in 93, the U.S. pulled out in 94. And then, tragically, the U.S. largely stood by during the Rwandan genocide that same year. It raised hard questions about when and where America had a responsibility to intervene.
But intervention did happen in the Balkans.
Yes, that became a major focus. The U.S. led NATO peacekeeping efforts in Bosnia starting in 95, and then in 99, NATO launched an air war against Serbia to stop the ethnic cleansing of Albanians in Kosovo under Slobodan Milosevic.
And the Middle East remained a challenge.
Always. Clinton hosted that famous handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn in 1993, a moment of high hopes. But lasting peace remained elusive.
And hovering over all of this, a new threat was emerging.
Radical Islamist terrorism, specifically al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, who declared war on the United States.
We saw precursors to 9/11 during this period.
We did. The bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, and then the attack on the USS Cole warship in Yemen in 2000. The threat was becoming very real.
Back home, though, the big political drama of the second term was scandal.
The Monica Lewinsky affair. It started with the Whitewater investigation, a tangled real estate deal from Clinton's Arkansas days. But it morphed into an investigation about Clinton lying under oath about his relationship with Lewinsky, a White House intern.
Which led to impeachment.
Right. The House of Representatives, controlled by Republicans, passed 2 articles of impeachment in December 1998. Perjury and obstruction of justice.
But the Senate acquitted him.
Yes, in early 1999. The necessary 2/3 majority wasn't there. And what's fascinating is public opinion. Americans generally disapproved of Clinton's personal behavior, strongly. But they approved of his job performance and his policies, and most didn't want him removed from office.
That disconnect is really something. And it all sets the stage for the election of 2000, Al Gore versus George W. Bush.
An absolute nail-biter. Gore running on continuity, Bush promising to restore dignity and pushing tax cuts, and it all came down to Florida.
The hanging chads.
Exactly. Weeks of recounts, legal challenges. It was chaos. Ultimately, the Supreme Court stepped in.
In a very controversial decision.
Highly controversial. A 5-4 vote, largely along partisan lines, stopped the manual recounts in Florida. The reasoning was that having different counties use different standards for counting votes violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment.
So Bush wins Florida by a hair, and thus the Electoral College.
By 271 to 266 electoral votes. But, and this is crucial, Al Gore won the national popular vote by more than 500,000 votes.
The first time since 1888 that the popular vote winner lost the election. That cast a shadow, didn't it?
A huge shadow. Bush started his presidency under this cloud of perceived illegitimacy for many. It was a really bitter end to the decade.
So looking back at the whole decade, 1992 to 2000, what's the takeaway legacy? We got economic prosperity, globalization really took hold, the deficit vanished for a bit.
All true. But we also saw those fierce debates over the social safety net, over trade, continue unresolved, and any trust gained in government seemed eroded again by scandal and that intense partisanship.
And there's a deeper fragmentation happening too, isn't there?
I think that's the key synthesis. The late 20th century saw mass culture splinter. Cable TV, then the internet. It created what the book calls a niche nation. You had all these virtual communities, but fewer shared national experiences.
People weren't all watching the same 3 TV networks anymore.
Exactly. Or reading the same newspapers. That cultural and media fragmentation perfectly mirrors the political fragmentation we saw culminate in that razor-thin, disputed 2000 election.
That's a powerful connection. So maybe the thought to leave everyone with is this. How did that technological and social fragmentation of the 90s, where we started living in slightly different information worlds, set the stage for the even more polarized political and media environment we live in today in the 21st century?
Something definitely worth thinking about. The roots run deep.
Indeed. Well, thank you for walking us through that complex decade, and thank you all for joining us on the Deep Dive.